started. Swastik, can you please repeat once?
Sure. I'll start from the beginning. To guide us through this complex dialogue, we are honored to have the session chaired by Ms. Debolina Guha, currently serving as the Assistant Professor of English at Shri Shiksayatan College, University of Calcutta. Our keynote speaker today is a scholar who has consistently pushed the boundaries of how we theorize the unseen and the marginal. I welcome Dr. Margaret Lyngdoh, a research fellow in Indigenous folklore studies at the University of Tartu, Faculty of Arts and Humanities, Institute of Cultural Research. To continue with the session, I now request the chair, Ms. Guha, to kindly take over the proceedings.
Thank you, Swastik, and a warm welcome to Dr. Margaret Lyngdoh to this special keynote session, and a warm welcome to everyone as well. We just now had a wonderful panel discussion coordinated by Dr. Deepika, and now we are moving on to yet another very interesting session. The title has already been said by Swastik. May I have the honor to introduce Dr. Margaret Lyngdoh to the audience here. Dr. Margaret Lyngdoh received her PhD in 2016 from University of Tartu, Estonia. She was the 2016 Albert Lord Fellow at the Center for Studies in Oral Tradition, University of Missouri, and received the Estonian Research Council Grant Postdoctoral Fellowship for her project from 2018 to 2021. She was the editor of the Journal of the International Society for Folk Narrative Research from 2019 to 2022. And as a researcher at the Department of Estonian and Comparative Folklore, she has vastly published in international peer-reviewed journals and has also contributed in different edited collections. Right now, she is focused on developing an Indigenous religious research method that she hopes will foster equitable collaboration between communities and research. With no further ado, may I again warmly welcome Dr. Lyngdoh to take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Guha. I hope all of you can hear me. Yeah?
Yeah,
and,
clearly audible, ma'am. Yeah.
Can you see my presentation?
Not yet, but we can see you're trying to share something. The PPT isn't visible yet.
Okay, just a second. Just a second. Just a second. Now, can you see it?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I'm going to put it on full screen. Can you still see it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I will start by telling you that it is our empirical research material that finally determines the paths of analysis that we as scholars adopt. It is not enough to theorize or categorize on a given religious or folkloristic phenomena without looking at whether such approaches would further the salient quest for meaning-making in our scholarly endeavor. Thus, any attempt at ethical representation of indigenous voices means that worldviews shared by our interlocutors really feed into our academic concepts and determine our interpretations and meaning-making. This is not a valorized statement that comes out of invested research intentions. It just means that we choose to find our best approaches possible that would benefit the endeavor of knowledge creation. Today, I focus on worldviews derived from the indigenous communities that reside in Northeast India. This keynote talk will address issues that concern perspectives, worldview, and folklore that are derived from indigenous religious traditions, and I am particularly concerned with the questions of theory and methodology to approach materials that are derived and pertain with sensitive, minority, and indigenous folklore. And the question is why? I ask 3 core questions around which I organize the content of my talk today. What constitutes a scientific engaged research method as advocated by the leaders of the International Society for the History of Religion, IAHR, to engage impartially with sensitive materials of such origin? Second question, why does the history of scholarship on marginalized communities matter today? And the third question, why do we need a sensitive, collaborative, and equitable approach embedded into our theoretical approaches to fieldwork materials that are derived from Indigenous backdrops? But before I proceed, I will explain the context against which I locate the analytic framework that I propose, okay? So I come from the Khasi community, and in context, utilize knowledge from my own communities and ontology to inform ethical approaches to anthropological theory and folkloristic as well, and fieldwork concerning Indigenous peoples. I qualify my usage of the terms indigenous and ethnic to refer to peoples who are historically and geographically contingent to place. I am familiar with Indigenous Northeast Indian ontologies in general, but I specialize on the worldview of the Khasi and the Karbi. So this is the map of Northeast India. I made it with AI yesterday, but as you can see, it is not always appropriate. You can see that there's an extension. This is after 5 tries with cloud, and it's just AI is stupid. So please ignore. You can see Northeast India and the regions that I work with. So Khasi and Karbi live in areas geographically contiguous to each other. They have close cultural continuities in their history, and Khasi villages may be found in present-day Karbi Anglong and vice versa. In the present day, they are part of different political states, Meghalaya and Assam, respectively. Now, the history of contemporary Northeast India is fraught with conflict and divisions that intensified after the colonization of the region. Now, following Indian independence in 1947, India assimilated several smaller kingdoms and peoples, bringing them under the administrative control of the union government. Today, Northeast India is made up of 8 states, in which there are 222 different indigenous and minority groups, each of whom struggles for representation in order to acquire recognition and benefits via the scheduled tribe status. I will address the concerns of the first question I ask. What constitutes a scientific, engaged research method as advocated by the leaders of the International Society for the History of Religion to engage impartially with sensitive materials of such origin? The background to this question lies in the debate that is ongoing in the academic circles of the scholars of the study of religion about the relevance of an engaged research that has activism embedded into its framework. I will show you that the subject under research matters, that it is impossible to work with folklore derived from indigenous worldviews without choosing a stance. So my example engages with the critical category of violence from the perspective of indigenous worldviews, and I do this provocatively because genetic portrayals of indigeneity highlight the peaceful, in union with nature, sketches of indigenous people, thus Adivasi and tribal people from Northeast India, are presented as to be and projected to live a simple life, as if we are incapable of philosophical depth, while media portrayals and government actions in the regions are anything but peaceful or simple. My example inverts the perspective. So here's the example. For over 150 years, Naga headhunters and skulls of trophy were exalted and fetishized as being the pinnacle of primitive barbarism and savagery. So much so that the skulls became trophies for the colonizers themselves. There are about 112 to 120 Naga tribes in the present day. As part of the Restore, Recover and Decolonize repatriation project of Naga human remains from the Pitts Rivers Museum, a startling discovery was made. Among the Konyak Naga, when a beloved shaman, chief, or person with an elevated status in society passes away, Clan members separate the head and preserve the skull, that then goes on to assume ancestor status in the community and clan. The skulls in these contexts don't belong to the enemy, but are symbols of connection, lineage, ancestry, and genealogy. So violence in this context is a blanket category that is heaped indiscriminately onto the material symbol of, in this case, the skull. This example resists the flattening of the meaning of what violence is or is manifested in Indigenous communities by showing how the materiality of the concept, here the skull, may mean multiple things and can have multiple contexts. Can a researcher then, dear audience, maintain a non-engaged perspective and academic stance in a context like this? My second question: why does the history of scholarship on marginalized communities matter today? What happens when we ascribe neutrality, objectivity, and noble scholarly intentions with dishonesty, and then this written document goes on to become an authoritative text that then leads to misrepresentation and genealogical damage that continues to haunt the Indigenous psyche even today? To answer this question, I bring in an example from my own community, the Khasi. So the ethnographic monograph, The Khasis, by Philip Thornhawk Gurdon, published in 1906, even today looked upon as the most authoritative account of the Khasi people, claimed to have an unbiased scientific ethnography of the Khasi communities in Northeast India. Thus, phrases like, "In conclusion, I only have to commend this work to the consideration of all interested in the accurate and detailed description of primitive custom. It is, I think, an excellent example of research and well fitted to stand at the head of a series which may be expected to make an important contribution to the data of anthropology." And this is in the introduction by C.S. Lyle, another administrative officer. And then Gurdon himself writes, "This book is an attempt to give a systematic account of the Khasi people, their manners and customs, and their ethnological affinities, their laws and institutions, their religious beliefs, their folklore, their theory as to their origin, and their language." What mistakes did Gurdon make then that I make this claim of misrepresentation and genealogical damage that impacts the community even today? So, in order to make a systematic account, Gurdon divided a single narrative in the section Folklores into separate episodes. What was once meant to be a composite oral epic was broken into sectional pieces that he characterized into etiology and origin narratives. Conspicuously missing from this section is the story of the DNA tree that is core now to the myth of Khasi origins. Globalization and the onslaught of Western education alongside missionary activity meant that the written word began to be privileged and thus replaced the sacred oral narrative. I would like to stress that narratives ensure ritual efficacy among Khasi. The consequences of the later privileging of the written word over the oral meant that these narratives of covenants were internalized by later ritual performers who also fragmented the origin narratives in ritual. So it was only when I worked in Northern Khasi Hills in the year 2008 that the Tiger Man, D. Singh Marin, chanted the narrative of the entire unbroken epic. He explained how all episodes in the narrative of origins are crucial to the culturally significant divination of the egg. Here is where I make my first suggestion about the usage of an alternative methodological model, where I show how an ethical and equitable engagement with the community can lead to new understandings of empirical material, this is because I allowed the perspective of my interlocutor to feed into my conceptual schema. And thus I was able to make this crucial discovery about an oral epic that never was documented. I took into account the perspective of the Tiger Man that I was able to come to the interpretation and discovery of this lost oral epic and its place in ritual. This is what I mean by a recursive approach, but I will talk more about this in a while. Coming now to my final question. Why do we need a sensitive, collaborative, and equitable approach embedded into our theoretical approaches to fieldwork materials that are derived from Indigenous backdrops? To answer this question honestly and ethically as a scholar, I will tell you that I ended up coming up with an alternative approach because contemporary theories in anthropology and folkloristics of religion remain inadequate to interpret and understand Indigenous ontologies. I'm sorry, but here's where it gets a bit dense. In Euro-America, ideas and matter are thought of as two distinct categories. But how can researchers approach knowledge from communities who see concepts and objects as the same, as many Indigenous people do? This model develops a new method that can be applied to critically interpret data that stems from Indigenous cultures, rather than encourage the creation of new ethic paradigms that can be used to construe meaning out of cultures that are separate from the context that stems from the community, that are separate from that of the context where from data has been derived. I propose the vernacular apparatives of the tradition trope that stems from the community itself as a means of analysis. This means that motifs from Indigenous philosophies become analytical tools through which the researcher can conclude meanings of given phenomena. Elements or concepts already extant within a given Indigenous community contributes to the multivalence of meanings that are time and location contingent. IRRM, the Indigenous Religious Research Method, is concerned more with the lived experience of religion as it is articulated through currents and constellations of Indigenous knowledges and narratives. And tradition tropes are a new way of religious and cultural mapping. Thus, the Indigenous religious research method can be viewed as a development stemming from the ontological turn. Now, the ontological turn in anthropology, just as a background, okay? In anthropology, religious studies, and folklore is a series of methods that proposes the acknowledgement of cosmological difference where it can be located, the adoption of recursivity in the field, and perspectivism. Eduardo Viveros de Castro, 1998, views bodies as envelopes and souls as continuous, and he explores multinaturalism in opposition to multiculturalism, and casts Amerindian cosmology as indigenous theology. Philippe Descola, 2011, offers a different schema, working towards multiple models of being, that's naturalism, animism, analogism, and totemism. Martin Holbrad, another proponent of the ontological turn, argues that the inherent political implications of the ontological turn include the prioritization of Indigenous belief systems, and that its openness to difference ensures that the movement is revolutionary. The contributions of multi-species ethnography must thus be seen as one aspect of a larger quest in the social sciences and humanities to replace dualist ontologies with relational perspectives. And this is because we need to overcome anthropocentrism by pointing out the meaningful agency of the other than human others, and to highlight the intersections among ecological relations, political economies, and cultural representations. So this method, central to this project, the IRRM, engages with and develops a core tenet of the ontological turn. Rather than assuming that all beings live in one objective world but understand it differently, it considers that instead different cultures inhabit entirely different worlds. In analyzing Indigenous communities dealing with the significant and often devastating changes brought by globalization, IRRM locates itself within the context of the anthropological study of development. Ideas from the ontological turn work alongside the concepts of the ontological domination, yeah? an ontological counter-hegemony. So Philippe Escobar suggests that the state doesn't merely intervene in indigenous territories through administrative or economic policies. It also enforces a particular way of being, an ontological regime that defines what counts as real and legitimate, thus negating a myriad of other real and legitimate knowledges. Our categories of being and knowing are not neutral reflections of reality, if such reflections of reality even exist. They are instead shaped by historical and contemporary power relationships. Development projects and foreign interventions function as exercises in ontological domination. Their cultural and tangible impacts, exemplified by structural adjustment programs and the work of foreign-funded NGOs, embed outsider notions of progress and rationality into the fabric of local life. Ontological approaches thus become essential to the anthropological study of development. IRRM approaches indigenous communities in flux and approaches a practical method to complement the ontological turn, recognizing and addressing the weaknesses of the movement that have been recognized throughout the last quarter century. While significant theoretical work exists on the ontological turn, the turn is for some controversial. So what are the criticisms? Critics point out that if there are multiple ontologies, then there must be multiple interpretations of these ontologies. But despite the scholarly acknowledgements of these multitudes, the endless interpretation of these pluralities should have engendered have not materialized. A pillar of the OT, ontological turn, is radical openness to difference. But conversely, as David Graeber says, this may also be viewed as undermining in turn the connectedness of humans and the world they inhabit. Perhaps most relevant to this project, the ontological turn still considers and categorizes ontologies ethically. The movement has historically employed Western frameworks to comprehend varying and often unclassifiable belief streams. This is a fundamental flaw in the philosophy and the exact knowledge and practice gap that is addressed by IRRM. IRRM, this indigenous religious research method that I propose, builds on the metafolklore works of Alan Dundes, which examine folklore about folklore, and employs Charles Briggs's method of vernacular theorizing, which engages the interlocutor in conversation about narrative meaning to offer illustrations of the social lives of narratives as they travel through ontologies and across realms. In this way, IRRM begins a significant anthropological wave in the 21st century and enhances a practical complement to this wave by integrating OT approaches with indigenous ways of knowing. For today's keynote, I highlight only one aspect of IRRM, which is the identification of tradition tropes. And here's my example of how we can identify a tradition trope. Consider a fresh field worker in folkloristics going into the field for his or her PhD research in Northeast India. The field worker may or may not be from the culture that is being researched. In either case, existing materials would have already been consulted and scrutinized if they exist, which is often not the case in Northeast India. The field worker may contact the elders or tradition bearers of the community in which he or she is working. In the event that there is a storytelling session, the field worker will likely use a recording device with permission. Perhaps the next day, the field worker seeks out any places that are mentioned in the stories heard the previous night. While he or she reaches the location, if, for example, the researcher is working among the Kasi, she or he may find megaliths that recall other stories, origin narratives, legends, myths. In folkloristics, it is established and accepted that there are multiple variations in the same narratives, but perhaps every version references the megaliths and place that the field worker visits. The field worker recalls that the Kasi harvest festival begins with the veneration of the megalith at that same sacred place. If there is a corpus of knowledge that interlinks the sacred place, then stone becomes a reference point. Stone as a tradition trope is identified, and a whole new domain of knowledge is thrown open. The field worker begins to identify patterns that link, for example, agrarian festivals with mortuary ones. The tradition trope stone becomes a portal to parallel realms or congruent geographies and thus links with other tradition tropes. If, however, the field worker encounters difficulty identifying tradition tropes alone, he or she may organize in a roundtable or community discussion, explain the concept of tradition tropes, and synthesize knowledge with the community. Tradition tropes are dense categories that emerge at the point of analysis. Tradition tropes can be tangible, but they are not always so. But if a tangible aspect is identified as a tradition trope, like stone, then the measurable experience of religion is focused upon what the body does, for example, which materiality is included in religious production. Where does the indigenous religious belief manifest? Where can indigenous faith and the practice of that faith be located? In what tangible forms does indigenous religious expressions exist? How does this tangibility implicate or refer back to intangible traditions? While this method aims to counter stereotypes that suggest indigenous people live in harmony of nature, for instead, and I say this rather that indigenous people often live in spite of the natural world with whom they are often at war. It draws upon the same natural world to identify core concepts around which community expression extrapolates. IRRM also allows for new conceptualization to point nuanced portraits of what nature means in individual, independent religious traditions. Links to nature are brought to the forefront, but rather than reducing our understanding of indigenous religions to stereotype, the variety, the difference, the uniqueness of indigenous religions is instead revealed. Motifs from indigenous religious philosophies become analytical tools through which the researcher can conclude meanings of given phenomena. Thus, IRRM is concerned more with the lived experience of religion. So IRRM calls on scholars to work with communities to identify primordial symbols that can serve as tradition tropes. Instead of focusing on a general idea such as death, IRRM urges researchers to adopt tradition tropes that includes its core aspect, such as corpse, fire, ash, birds, whatever, depending on the mortuary rituals of a given community. Food can be TT, tradition trope, as can the body. These sometimes specific materialities of tradition tropes give insight into the numerous aspects of a people, acting as religious centerpieces around which behavior, belief, and ritual are arranged, and thus can be interpreted simultaneously through this multivalent lens. This approach both highlights the interdependency of indigenous humans and the landscapes around them, and underscores the complexity of site-specific practice. It attempts to take back and reclaim representations of indigenous religions from their philosophical Western trappings. So I will give you an example about what a tradition trope would look like. Okay, so my previous research has explored water as a tradition trope and a way of knowledge among the Khasi. If you look at this chart, and this looks actually complicated, but it's not really so. Water emerges as knowledge. Water is vernacular indigenous knowledge. This means that water is the sum of the relationships and narratives and practices and beliefs that produce worldview. So see, what I have done is that water has emerged as a tradition trope among Khasi. And what has happened is that I have used water as a conceptual category through which I have derived meaning, and water becomes an analytical category. So the tradition trope of water emerged organically and is a sum of worldview shaping relationships, narratives, practices, and beliefs among the Khasi. And finally, I will tell you that the examples I found were region specific, contradictory, and not intended to be hierarchical, because Khasi don't recognize structure or order in the same way that non-Khasi communities or Western modes of learning often perceive them. Water, in this case that I have found, is fluid, as are Khasi understandings of water. Considering water as a tradition trope among the Khasi allows for a new analytical bloom among previously disparate unrealized truths to Khasi culture. Finally, water among Khasi became a conceptual category which, when analyzed, could yield organic intellectual meaning about the place of water in worldview and the ways that Khasi makes sense of the world. One last point. In addition, RRRM could also integrate modern dynamic visualization methods using available technologies to make the method accessible to other scholars and expand the scope of this method to conduct research with indigenous communities globally. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lyngdoh. That was, I think, a marvelous presentation and giving too much of, food for thought, as you had started with certain pertinent questions about the scientific research method, followed by the question of the history of scholarship on the marginalized communities and the reason for being sensitive and, taking initiative into collaborative approach. And finally, as you had, through your very meticulous and rather sensitive way of looking at the Khasi and the Karbi community, you have taken up IRRM, Indigenous Religious Research Method, as one of the complementing research methodology to the ontological turn in anthropology, while also talking about how it is also, on the one hand, talking about a radical openness to difference, while it also comes under certain critique about being radically open to difference. And finally bringing us to the tradition trope and the last slide that had shown about water, as you have taken it as a conceptual category. I think this has given most of us, I think many of us can relate to our own cultural, specific, lived experiences, particularly about the tradition trope that you were talking. And the floor is open for questions and comments. If I may begin, can we consider certain, say, food habit, or because you were also talking about the tangible as well as the non-tangible tradition trope.
Yes.
So if we consider, say, certain particular kind of food, certain particular kind of culinary delicacy of a certain community, because recently I had the opportunity through CFSR, interacting with students from certain remote villages in Bengal. And many of them had shared about their experiences and how their grandparents are still continuing with certain particular cultural practice where a certain particular delicacy which is made after, say, a marriage ceremony, can that also come under, the way you are looking at the tradition trope?
Thank you so much for your question. Actually, I also mentioned that food can also be a tradition trope. So this, while you were making your research, can you name to me the core ingredient of this food?
They are talking about something called, which is in Bengal, we normally call it pithe or patishapta, but they had certain particular element that was used. I do not recollect right now, but I am still in contact with them. So maybe I'll just get back to them and sort of ask them. But I was thinking about, because they were sharing, and interestingly, as I came to know from them, that such practices are actually, becoming less prevalent even amongst their communities, right?
So if this particular element in the food, say for instance, if it's spinach, okay, if spinach is a core ingredient in this food, And if the mention of spinach will become like immediately associated with the tradition that it refers back to, for example, cultural memory, particular behavior, particular practice, or taboo that is associated with spinach, then definitely it comes under the category of a tradition trope. But then the question would be like, would it be a major tradition trope or a minor one? Because we can also, tradition tropes can be hierarchical in the sense that where in this map of the tradition trope network can it be located? So this is something that you can explore. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The floor is
Thank you so
open
much for
for
your question.
questions and comments. Please raise your hands, or you can sort of unmute yourself.
Is there any reason that you have selected Karbi Anglong? Is there any reason?
Yeah. Yes. This is. Please tell me your name. Who's the question?
Jolie. Yeah.
It's, Dr. Jolie, thank you so much for your question. There is a reason why I've selected Karbi Anglong. It's because it's geographically contiguous with the Khasi, and the second and more crucial reason why I have chosen it's because there is a cultural continuity between Khasi and Karbi cultural practices, because there's a lot of borrowings and interactions and intercultural community transactions between Karbi practice and Nar Jaintia practices. So you can find Khasi villages inside Karbi Anglong, and you can find Karbi villages inside Karbi Anglong. There's an entire community of Karbi who call themselves Marngar in northern Khasi Hills. So that it is almost undeniable in order to look at the linkages between these two communities. And that's the reason why. And Karbi have such a rich and dense network of tradition tropes that I can observe through their oral textual traditions. Yes, I hope I have answered your question.
Yeah, there is quite a lot of possibilities to work on Karbis.
Yes.
There's lots of, because it's, as you rightly said, Khasi, Karbi, continuum, then Janita, then they have a lot of stories to tell, crafts to go on. It's wonderful. Yeah. I really like the way you taken the trope of water. That was the high point. Really liked it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Well, the floor is open for comments as well, or anybody who wants to share their lived experiences.
Dr. Margaret, I have one question, that you are using IRR method. So how you are validating your data? It's validating and reliability of your data, because I also work on indigenous community. So like how you are validating your data with them? Like,
okay, thank you so much, Dr. Deepika, for your question. First of all, material that is derived from indigenous cultures is not mere data. It is knowledge.
Yes.
So this knowledge is validated by the community itself, which is the reason why I speak and I stress upon this concept of equitable collaboration. I am not the one who is saying that water is a tradition trope or can be looked at a conceptual category. That is me being a scholar, making an ethic analysis of what the Khasi already have isolated by their own selves. So validation of empirical material is something that is done by the community themselves. So in order to, how will I say, reliability, this is a very crucial this is a very crucial component of our fieldwork. And I think that reliability can be ensured by doing enough, asking the same questions to enough people that you find out multiple variations of the responses. Yeah. So this and other, and also we have to always remember to keep in mind ethical how ethically nuanced we have to be when we are doing our field work because of the we pay attention to the meta-communicative cues that are extant in the community. That is what ensures reliability and like the validity of knowledge. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deepika. I think
Can I go ahead with the question?
Yes, sir. After your question, we'll take Obirup's question.
Thank you, Margaret. It was a really wonderful presentation, and it's it's really great to see you after so long. And so the question is about your proposed research method, that is Indigenous religious research method. So how it is distinct from Indigenous research method, or why can't we call it Indigenous research method instead of particularly focusing on a particular word, religious? What is the necessity of bringing in religious into it?
Because it is because of my own limitations, because I am not focusing on political economy, I'm not looking at geography, I'm not looking at finance, indigenous finance, and these also come under the, indigenous people have geography, politics, history, finance, and all of this, because I am focused on folkloristics and the study of religion and anthropology, and that's the reason why I focus on this aspect. And that's all.
Okay, so basically, you are trying to talk about, you are only looking into the aspect of religion, and that is particularly to the Karbi community.
No. It is not. Please understand that we need to be very critical about our concepts. Also, I don't use the word religion. It's religious, because we don't know, apart from the big four, models of religion like Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism. Indigenous religions are so variegated. Their meanings and their manifestations and expressions are so multivalent and so different that it is very hard to call them religions. Because can you say that the Khasi have religion when there are no secret text? So when I say Khasi indigenous religion, I am ascribing agency to the Khasi religious practices by actually calling it a religion, because sometimes in the study of religion, we have so much of angst in understanding what religion is. Therefore, so I will tell you that I call it religious practice, indigenous religious research practice method, simply because it is also so that we are not able to sometimes make very hard distinctions between ways of life and faith and the manifestation of faith. So observance, for example, in the way that I give money to somebody would be with two hands, and that would also, it's also part of faith and good behavior, which is part of the way of life, which can be extended to something that is religious. So there is an inherent paradox in this idea of indigeneity and religious practices within it. Thank you.
So it's more about a way of life that this particular community, any particular community, is having.
An indigenous community, yes, particularly indigenous and minority communities.
Yeah. So by I'm just trying to extend the question to to the different part. So is this particular methodology can be applicable to a diverse indigenous communities areas like Arunachal Pradesh?
Of course. I have worked with the scholar Claire Scheid, and she has said that a core funerary traditions among, let's say, Adi and Nishi can be found in this. The tradition trope can be reduced to the aspect of the materiality of it, which is the corpse. So it is possible, because it is the tradition trope is a general outline. It is not very specific to a given community or a practice. At the moment, this method is under, how will I say, I am still developing it, and I'm right now applying it only to the indigenous communities in Northeast and maybe Central India. We will see. Yeah. Does it answer your question?
I think he's having a network glitch. We can move on to Opiru's question then. Opiru, if you are here, you can unmute and okay, I can see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm here. Yeah. Hi, Dr. Margaret. Thank you for the wonderful presentation on IRRM. I wanted to ask at a very basic level. So I would probably like to use Debolina's example because she was talking about Pita and Patishapta in Bengali communities. So if I break it down to its core ingredient, because you asked her what the core ingredient is. So pita cannot be made without rice. Rice becomes one of the core ingredient in both pita and patishapta. But what I wanted to what I wanted to understand using this example that Debolina used is where do we make a distinction between what we know in folkloristics already as motif of a cultural phenomena and a tradition trope. So for instance, by so far what I understand, you can please correct my understanding if it's flawed, that a motif of any cultural phenomena, if I take that motif away, the phenomena does not it stops existing in the way that it should, or the way it exists in that particular culture. So for instance, if I remove rice from pita, you cannot make pita anymore. So rice becomes a motif so for making pita. And as for your example, you also said water is a tradition trope for the Khasis. So if I remove water, all the narratives that were surrounding in that chart, do they still exist? And if they don't exist anymore, how do we make this distinction that water is a tradition trope and not a motif? Like, where does the distinction become, evident that something is a motif and something is a tradition trope? Or are they, or is it a gray area? Like, it's not as clear categorical distinction. Thank you.
Thank you for this very well observed question. It is something that I myself have thought through. So motifs are parts of, you can find motifs through, how will I say, within narrative, but tradition tropes are elements that recur and emerge from traditions. They are lived. They are not just spoken about, or they are not just written about. They are not storied only within stories. So motifs are something that you can find as the smallest component within a given narrative. A tradition trope pertains to practice. And this perhaps is the most important, and not just any practice, but lived practice, experienced practice, individualized practice, practice that is emergent, practice that is ongoing, practice that is continuous. So this is how I make the distinction. Thank you very much for this question. Yeah.
Dr. Preshi, you may unmute yourself.
Hi. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Hi, Margaret. Hope you are doing good.
Hi, Prayashi. It's nice to see you, Prayashi.
It's nice to see you after so long. So I have a question regarding your field area. Okay, you said that in Karbi Anglong there are many Khasi communities. So there is a place like a small village called Taralangsu in Karbi Anglong, where the Karbi Heritage Museum is there, right? Have you seen any Khasi villages nearby that village, the Taralangsu? Or have you seen any kind of artifacts or their traditional items in that Northengpi Karbi Heritage Museum? Or are they exchanged the ritual practices with the Karbis and the Khasis in Taralangsu?
So Taralangsu is a very unique geographical area.
Yeah.
It is the site for the expression and manifestation of the Karbi Youth Festival every year. It's called the Karbi People's Hall.
Yeah.
It's about 100 hectares of square of land. And this is where, yes, the Northengpi Museum is there. I recently, actually, about just 3 weeks ago, visited it.
Yeah.
Now, Taralangso and Northengpi, and the Northengpi Museum over there inside of it, they have like a lot of like it is like where they have kept, like they have tried to museumize Karbi culture. So, but the thing is, there is a lot of similarity between there's a lot of similarity between Khasi practices and Karbi practices in it. And it is not necessarily something that is appropriated, but more an expression of continuity, cultural continuity. But then the thing is that, for example, the ritual performer among Khasi is Lyngdoh. Among Karbi, he is known as Gurusar or Lyngdoh Po. Po stands for grandfather. So the thing is that there are linguistic similarities, but then the same thing, for example, among Panar, Jaintia, you will find the pillar paradigm as meaning something else. Among Karbi, you can also find the pillar paradigm as meaning something else. So there are these nuances that we cannot put blanket categorizations on that. Okay, you find the same thing among Karbi, you find the same thing among Khasi, and they mean the same thing, and that is not so. So this is something that we need to be very careful about homogenizing and making these linear kind of connections. Yeah, I hope I have answered your question.
Thank you so much. Like, have you seen any kind of Khasi practices in the Karbi Youth Festival?
Yes, there are lots of Khasi villages that come into practice in the Karbi Youth Festival. Karwang village is one of them. Umswa is one of them. So they come, they put up their little stalls. They come to show their the practices of making the Khasi and also Karbi baskets. So there's a lot of intercultural transactions that are ongoing there.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Preyoshi. If there aren't any more questions and comments, then we can wrap up this session. However, thank you, Dr. Lyngdoh, for this wonderful presentation once again. And yes, enough food for thought, particularly about the research methodology that you were talking, IRRM, and that has led to many queries, observations, and deeper thought into it. So hope to meet you once again, probably not anymore in virtual mode, but maybe face to face. Looking forward to one such conference when we all will be meeting, face to face. I think that would be more fruitful engagement and would lead to more critical dialogue. So
thank you so much, Dr. Debolina. Thank you so much, Dr. Deepika, and everyone else for having me here as your keynote today. Thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you,
Dr. Jolly.
For the session. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again. And thank you, everyone present in the session. Bye, ma'am. Bye.
Bye.
I think we can move on.